Okay, my guests today are Austen Bannan and Vinny Vernuccio. Um, Austin is a senior policy analyst of employment at Americans for Prosperity. His previous experience includes senior policy analyst and research fellow at the Charles Koch Institute, a legislative staffer at U.S. Congress, and director of outreach at the Ripon. Am I saying that right? Ripon Society? Ripon Society. Graduated from the University of Georgia with a BA in political science and anthropology. F. Vincent Vernuccio, who I call Vinny, is president and co-founder of Institute for the American Worker and holds advisory positions with several organizations, including the Mackinac Center, where he is a senior fellow. Vernuccio served on the U.S. Department of Labor transition team for the Trump administration and as a member of the Federal Service Impasses panel. Under former President George W. Bush, he served as Special Assistant Secretary for Administration and Management in the Department of Labor. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Hey, David, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, so this week, Republicans on the House Committee on Education and Workforce introduced 5 bills that are supposed to update the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959. I almost always call it the LMRDA. Earlier this month on the Senate side, Senators Bill Cassidy, Jim Banks from Indiana, Tommy Tuberville, and Tim Scott from South Carolina introduced a total of 7 bills that would reform our country's labor laws, including the National Labor Relations Act. At the same time, there are Republicans, Josh Hawley in particular, that are pushing union reforms, quote unquote, that would build alliances with unions like the Teamsters. But many of those bills have found a lot of principled opposition on the Republican side. So this is all great timing for a comprehensive report on what it should mean to be pro-worker. The Institute for the American Worker, seeing the opportunity, had Austen Bannan produce such a report. It's called How to Empower Workers, Embracing a Pro-Worker Agenda Built on Choice. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit today and then focus on some of the news out of these committees. So first, I'll just start, guys. What does pro-worker mean to you?
Pro-worker means putting individuals first, empowering them to make the choices that are best for them and their families, work with who they want, work with how they want, and support themselves and their families how they want. And, I'll take a little bit of liberty here. I mean, I'm biased. I'm the president of I4AW. Austin's done great work at AFP. He's a senior fellow with us. But the Empowering Workers report that he put together is absolutely amazing. It is essentially the encyclopedia of both good labor policy and policy that, does not, let's just say, does not put those individual workers first. And that's all available at our website, the4aw.org, i4aw.org. And if you click on resources, you can click on the Empowering Workers tab and go right there, or i4aw.org/pro-worker. And it'll take you to a really dynamic site on our website that harnesses all the great information in Austin's study and breaks down all of the different labor issues at a federal level and says, are they pro-worker? Do they empower workers? Or do they not? And of course, it also links directly to Austin's great study. And Austin, it was absolutely fantastic. I'm so glad you were able to write that study with us, and you're a senior fellow with us. Great job again.
Well, Austin, so I mean,
Pleasure, and it's, you kind of mentioned this. It's sort of a download of great policies. Congress, sometimes has difficulty enacting great policies, but we may be able to highlight that there's actually dozens of great bills that have been introduced, and we're really trying to ignite the interest in those, and not just have them live with some great champions of those bills, and then have our organizations here advocating for these things sort of in an echo chamber. We really want to grow this movement. I think we can make reforms, and they're popular with workers. The things that we're proposing aren't things that we have to convince workers are great. We've known that for a while, and we're trying to help leaders that sometimes I think they see workers struggle, and we understand it. There's a lot of difficulties in the modern workplace adjusting, but the way things operated 90, 100 years ago, when a lot of the labor laws that govern us today were put into place, don't apply to people today. They were 50, 60% of our workforce were in manufacturing and agriculture. It was dangerous blue collar jobs. And some jobs still have dangers today, but that workforce that kind of works in manufacturing and agriculture, it's less than 10% of our workforce today. And between that and modern technology and how people can work, there's so many different demands, and flexibility is really the answer. We don't want top down from government agencies. We don't want union leaders to speak on behalf of workers. We want workers to have tools to make unions and their workplaces and everything else democratic and represent what they're looking for. There's nothing wrong with freedom of association, but we want the freedom to be a big part of association, which is what we do when we're empowering workers.
So you mentioned some tools that workers are interested in. Can you give us sort of a flavor of what kinds of things specifically workers want in today's economy?
Yeah, well, only about half the states today have something that's called a right to work policy. It's a simple concept, and it seems to make sense to workers. In fact, union workers prefer it at an even higher level than the general public because they've lived this. But if you're at a place that's unionized, you should have an ability to say, I don't want to be a member of this third-party organization, and I don't want part of my paycheck to contribute to that organization. So right to work just means you have freedom over your paycheck and not forced to associate with a union, just as a matter of being able to have a job somewhere. And then a lot of what we are working on here in this paper that would empower workers flows from that. We want secret ballot elections. Workers should be able to vote with their conscience. There's a lot of tools that unions have, unfortunately, to harass workers, whether it's at the workplace or going to their homes, acquiring private contact information. And then workers may feel, sort of pressured to say, yes, I have an interest in a union, but at least you have a secret ballot to truly say what you want. And then we want a majority of workers to participate in union elections. So you don't want, there's occasions that have happened where a very small amount of workers were even aware of a unionization effort. And several workers could vote for a union, and everyone is now represented. So we want to make sure there's a healthy number, such as some legislation that we've highlighted where 2/3 of workers would have to participate in an election for it to be a valid union election. We want workers to control their information. I just mentioned information privacy. There's legislation that would force this, and rules and regulations that have tried to essentially turn information that businesses have on their workers into sort of an open invitation for unions to ask for it and receive it, and not only use it for a potential union election, but use it for outreach and their own recruitment tools. And so people can control this information. And then we also want people, the one thing that Right to Work doesn't produce, even if you leave a union, you're not leaving the union's control over your job and what's dictated. You're part of a collective bargaining contract. We would like workers, and Vinny's worked a lot on what is called a Workers' Choice Act, but the concept of workers' choice is, not only do you have choice over a membership in the union, but you have choice of creating your own contract. Maybe you only want to work for the employer and you don't want to be serving both the union and the employer in a contract, and you feel like you can negotiate something unique for your family, for yourself, that's different than what the one-size-fits-all bargaining approach has. So that's a lot of it. And we also delve into things that are not union related. There's over almost 70 million people now do some form of independent work each year, some form of freelancing, whether it's just a couple hours and a little gig on the side or it's their actual career. We want to help preserve these self-employment pathways. And that's something that essentially increasingly because of technology, it's so easy for individuals to connect to businesses to provide their services and to connect with customers. Much more difficult decades ago before we were in the information age to kind of build a client list and say, I'm a service provider and I can help all these people all around the country with a quick email or a call. So we're really just, again, trying to facilitate what the modern opportunities are and make sure our laws empower workers in that respect.
So we usually deal with public sector unions on this program. We're talking here about mostly private sector reforms. What sorts of industries, what sorts of workers do you think are most interested in having these kinds of tools in their employment life?
Sure. Just going back and echoing a couple things that Austen said, it all feeds into this. So between the independent contractors and what I love about what Austen did with his empowering workers study is there's a lot of survey data there. So it's not, I mean, I love the law, I'm an attorney, David, I know you are too. But not everybody likes the, well, here's the legal arguments and stuff like that. But there's a lot of survey data from workers, from even union members, encapsulated in that study, showing how popular these ideas are. So you were asking what industries, independent contracting. And, it's not just, Uber or Lyft drivers. That's a part of it. But it's freelance writers. It's people like Kim Cavan, who has come in to testify before both the House and the Senate, and leading the fight in New Jersey to protect her right to work for herself. It's people like that that are supportive of their independence and their ability to choose how they want to work and with who they want to work and in what formats. Austen talked about right to work and the vast popularity of right to work, even among union members. Just want to expand on his definition or break it down. What right to work means, it just simply means that a union can't get a worker fired for not paying them. That is the heart of right to work. It's that unions can't say, well, pay us or you lose your job. Now, if they're doing a good job and workers want to pay them, they're more than welcome to do that. But that then opens the door for those other policies that Austen was talking about, like workers' choice, and allowing workers to fully opt out of those union contracts, even in right to work states. And most of those are encapsulated in the Employee Free Choice Act. So Representative Rick Allen in the House from Georgia introduced it over the summer, and Senator Scott just introduced it about a month ago in the Senate. And that is kind of the catch-all omnibus pro-worker legislation of this Congress, which protects the secret ballot, which protects the worker privacy that Austen was talking about. Workers' choice protects that ability of workers to say, no, I want to negotiate the contracts that's best for myself. It protects independent contractors and their ability to work for themselves. It also protects worker privacy, saying that only certain information can be given to unions and that the worker is the one that chooses that information, instead of a federal board saying, well, just give them cell phone numbers, home addresses, all of that. And there's a whole bunch of other workforce protections encapsulated in the ERA, and that is kind of the catch-all. And then there's other legislation that Austen was talking about, such as the Worker Enfranchisement Act that Representative Bob Onder from Missouri introduced, that requires a quorum of workers to vote before a union can receive a monopoly, that protects that right to a secret ballot. And those are also encapsulated in Senator Cassidy's Results Act and the package of bills that the Senate introduced earlier this month. So, David, I've been doing this a long time. The last about 60 days in Congress, I don't know if I've seen this many pro-worker pieces of legislation introduced. It is an incredibly exciting time and absolutely the perfect time for Austen to release that study with I4AW, because there's a lot of good stuff out there right now.
Now, it sounds like, between, say, right to work, you mentioned a secret ballot guarantee. You've also got a measure here for worker privacy with their information. It sounds like those would be beneficial not just for the independent contractors, but for the folks who work in a factory, folks who work at millions of home care agencies across the country, any private sector employee, right?
Yeah, that's right. And Austen was talking about the manufacturing. What's really interesting with manufacturing is that in right to work states, manufacturing jobs are actually growing. So when you embrace worker freedom, when you are pro-worker, when you don't have that one size fits all contract, or you can actually make sure that workers have a choice whether or not they want to pay the union, those pro-worker policies, that's where manufacturing is going. That is where we are seeing actual job growth in manufacturing. So it really is interesting.
So it sounds like one of the major problems here in the private sector is like one that we've talked about in the public sector on this program. You've got a one size fits all. What you mean is a contract governing an entire collective bargaining unit. And because you've got this one contract that a bunch of people have to work under, it doesn't provide for all the little things that an individual worker might need along the way. Even something like authority to take a second job outside of the workplace, choice on how to structure one's hours, when to get paid, and all that kind of stuff. Is that fair to say that that's the major problem with the private sector industry these days?
I mean, the major problem with private sector labor law is that it was written for the Industrial Revolution. It's almost 90 years old. It's created for an economy, the 1930s economy, and it doesn't reflect what today's modern workers want. So
Hmm.
it's that adversarial, one size fits all relationship between unions and employers that treat workers not like individuals, but like collective bargaining has, a collective. So I think that is the heart of the problem with today's collective bargaining is that it is outdated and it has not been modernized for a modern workforce. And Austin, I think you encapsulate a lot of that really well within the study.
Well, he did. So let me quote the first paragraph here, Austin, before I ask you to weigh back in. American workers today face an increasingly shifting and more technological job market, yet many laws governing employment are nearly a century old. Unfortunately, some political and union leaders have doubled down on those laws, and as a result, workers are increasingly chasing permission instead of opportunity. So what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Permission and opportunity?
Yeah. So, we can't guarantee what everything looks like in the future in an evolving economy. But what we can guarantee with good policies is opportunity. We know we're an advanced nation with a lot of opportunities, a strong economy, but so many pieces of red tape that come from agencies. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
whether it comes from union demands or a lawmaker. We see it promulgated out in rules that hold people back. And it's this idea, it's like, I want to work, independently as a self-employed worker, and I have this relationship that's going to be great with these business clients. Nobody has a complaint except for government saying, no, you can't have that type of relationship. This also, by the way, applies to franchises and small businesses. They like to be vendors for other businesses. Say you're a
Hmm.
communications firm, and you're a small business. You don't need to have a full-time communications staffer. You're going to have somebody come and help you, advertise or bring a message out, or you're going to work with, a legal service to help, build something up for your company. You don't want to have full-time workers all the time. You want specialization. And so that's independent contractors, and it's also small businesses. And there's something called the Save Local Business Act that would also, protect franchises in America from having what's called a joint employer, where all of a sudden a small business is subject to the employment of this other business that's simply working with them or has a partnership with them. So, when we're talking about permission, it's this, slow build of 100 years of laws where you can't simply go out and say, here's a customer or a business that wants to work with me in this way. We're happy, and we can make this happen and build a mutually beneficial relationship. Instead, there's somebody that has a notion of how exactly it should look, and we're trying to remove that because right now there's so much opportunity for success with some of the flexibility and choice that workers could have. And unfortunately, again, there's some that sort of look at a century ago as almost a golden era, which, it wasn't. There's obviously a growing America then, but a lot of the changes that took place, didn't happen just because of unions. And yet there's this belief that everybody needs to be unionized, maybe to have workers prosper. The
Hmm.
40-hour work week, I point out in the paper, Henry Ford instituted this, and there were some small businesses that were also doing this, but he did it more than a decade before a union ever entered, the auto plants and the auto industry in America. And safety, came when electricity came to the workplaces, and there was better lighting, and there was competition between businesses. A lot of these things happen naturally, and unions can be an association that advocates for good or bad. And so it's, we're not saying there's anything wrong with associating, but we're looking at this to say, there shouldn't be a structure that's coercive. We want voluntary
Hmm.
association, and too much of this is involuntary. So you have to ask for permission either from government or for unions to change some slow-moving contract when you
Right.
could just do it right now if we just gave opportunity.
So our friend Josh Hawley, Republican, has talked a big game about getting in bed with workers and their union officials. I mean, Republicans should be a pro worker party, right? Um, what is Josh Hawley doing? What's wrong with it? I'll go ahead and lead you in that direction because I know generally how you feel about it. What's wrong with what Josh Hawley's doing?
Well, first, I mean, Republicans are a pro-worker party, and Austin, sorry, I'll just jump in really quick here. You look at the package from the Senate that Senator Cassidy is now chair of, and between his bill, Senator Tuberville, Senator Scott's bills, and the other ones, all very pro-work about putting workers first, protecting privacy, streamlining the NLRB, and then the transparency bills that the House just put out with Ed and Workforce from Representative Fox and Harris and Fine and Representative Onder about getting more information so workers can make more informed decisions. To the Employee Rights Act that we already covered, all incredibly pro-worker. But it's putting those workers first, and it's getting transparency and accountability for those workers. Juxtapose that with some of the things that Senator Hawley is pushing for. And essentially, most of his framework is borrowed from two bills. One is the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, led by Bernie Sanders, so you can kind of know where the point of view is there. But essentially, it's the Democrat and union wish list. And he carves a couple pieces out, but essentially, his framework is a PRO Act light. And we go into details on that on the website, i4aw.org. And then it's borrowed from this other bill called the Warehouse Workers Protection Act, which has things that are so controversial that President Clinton tried them, and Congress said, no, you can't, and actually stop regulations at the 11th hour that President Clinton was trying. So, but put that aside. So that's essentially where his baseline is. The one bill that he has fully introduced is his Faster Labor Contracts Act. And this would literally allow the government to mandate an arbitration panel that would write a first contract between the employer, union, and workers. And workers would not even get a vote on this. So I testified before the Senate a couple weeks ago, and this was really interesting. Chairman Cassidy asked the Democrat witness, who was a union shop steward, actually from Missouri, from Senator Hawley's home state, if the government had this panel wrote this contract, workers would not get a vote. Do you support that? It was a paraphrase, but essentially. And the guy turns a little ashen and goes, no, that's undemocratic. That defeats the whole point of the union. So even these union leader, he's a shop steward, when presented with not who's supporting this bill, not who's introducing it, not the names, but just the facts of what it would do, don't think these things are a good idea. And that is incredibly telling. So sorry, Austen, I know I interrupted you for a little bit there.
No, not at all. Those are all great points. And I think it's sort of this notion that maybe there's a desire to empower workers by everybody, but there's this sort of misaligned vision where I think some of Senator Hawley's ideas, and we hope people will kind of orient more towards what we're saying here, because we know workers want it. But he's sort of looking at it as it's good for workers to be unionized, and it needs to happen now. And let's not worry about fixing the policies that kind of make unions undemocratic and that don't give workers a voice. He wants to sort of force these, it's called ambush elections, but essentially trying to get an election to happen within 20 days or less. A business has never experienced what a unionization process is like. Workers know nothing about the pros and cons. And the other ideas he's floated is sort of coupling a ban on employers actually meeting with their workers about what unionization is. And imagine you build a business yourself, a small business, and all of a sudden workers have gotten this interest in unionizing from a couple union leaders, and they've never heard from their employer about what he or she thinks and what's good or bad about it. And couldn't we talk about something that maybe you wish you had? But all of a sudden, within 20 days, a union is going to be there, and then the whole apparatus, of kind of forced membership, contracts that apply to everyone, a business not being able to cater to somebody who has family needs here and another person who has ambitions that are different from a different worker. All of that is out the door, and you've never even been able to talk to your workers about it. So, we're trying to put the brakes on that and say we could make this process open. There can be benefit from a union or other organizations that can kind of speak for workers in a certain way if it's actually what workers want. If it can't be the workers' voice unless they're actually open to choose what the message is and what they're trying to be represented with.
So the bill that he's introduced that would make it easier to enter into that first contract. Is that am I getting that right? And if
Yes,
if they don't reach a contract by a certain given time, then there's some sort of
I believe
mediation.
it's within 90 days, and then there's a binding
Okay.
arbitration process. And that contract could be settled in a way that, frankly, not even the unions like, but certainly not workers or businesses. And that it's a take it or leave it. That's going to be instituted. So yeah, it's a very difficult process. Um, and again, we're showing there's so many alternatives to what could be done here. To create an open
I
process.
wonder if he's responding in part to this thing that's happened with Starbucks, and it's happened in a lot of other places as well. But a particular store unionizes, and then they sit down to negotiate a contract, and then the contract itself takes years sometimes to negotiate. In the meantime, the non-unionized Starbucks employees at the store down the street are getting their regular raises, bonuses, whatever it would be, and the union folks stay because they can't get anything while the contract's being negotiated. They stay at the same rate, and at the end, once they get their contract, they may get back pay or something like that. But it's taken a long time, and in the meantime, maybe some of these folks quit and go to the other store without the union. I mean, don't we want to fix that? Isn't that a problem that we should be fixing? Why would Senator Hawley's bill not be a good idea here?
So that's understandable from a perspective. I'll tell you something that we didn't bring up yet. What is the motivation behind this idea of a first contract? There's a big one, and it's the one that dictates everything else. Unions don't start collecting dues from workers for their advocacy in politics until there's a contract. And so, good, bad, or indifferent, once there's a contract, unions then can start collecting dues. And so, regardless of what the intent is, as we say, we understand to the extent, whatever current law is for how a union process works, if workers are trying to, utilize this process, you're right, there's a reason to be concerned. People deserve a fair contract in terms of the timing, but, the process, all the reforms that need to happen to help ensure that a business can get a contract that's fair for it as well, all of that's thwarted by this process. So, you're basically dictating the timeline, not the conversation.
And at the end of the day, is the contract a good thing for the workers involved? I'm not sure Hawley could answer that question. He basically throws it to an arbitrator who may or may not be able to make a good decision on that.
Yeah, it's a theoretical process, right? There's so many different unions out there. There are some workers who are happy with the current union and how it represents them. Many workers who are not. And so much of the money, something else we bring up in this, so much of the money that is collected from workers isn't utilized for a workplace contract. It's certainly not the case in the public sector, as you may know, David, when union dues are collected, but same thing in the private sector. Tens of billions of dollars between public and private sector unions go towards advocacy that isn't related to the workplace. And not to mention, some of the advocacy for unions may also differ from what workers want. By default, there's so many issues that have a variety of opinions, and yet unions often take progressive stances, despite the fact that almost half of union members in recent elections were voting towards Republican Party, for instance. And not all issues have to be tied to a party, or just all issue stances also shouldn't be tied to a union. When you're talking about the idea that you join a union based on having a good job and a good opportunity at your workplace, not as an extension of sort of your political voice. You should be able to do that on your own with your own earnings.
I've also read a little bit about Hawley's idea to introduce sectoral bargaining in the United States. Not necessarily a new idea. I know Orrin Cass has been pushing it from the right for some time at American Compass. It is also something that unions want to see. Why would sectoral bargaining be a bad thing in the private sector?
I mean, once again, we're going towards what should be focused on the individual to one size fits all. So I don't know if sectoral is in the framework or the PRO Act light that he's suggested, most of that is, pretty much copy and pasted from the PRO Act and that warehouse bill. But yeah, there is this American compass idea of sectoral, one size fits all, not just for a workplace, but for entire industries. And, they have it to an extent, and usually it's like a government mandated board where maybe you have, union or union affiliated or supported members creating these wage or hour boards or workplace boards. And, we see them to a limited extent in California and New York. But it really is that one size fits all. And David, going back to, before Austen answered that question, your question on Starbucks of workers not being able to get raises because they're waiting for that first contract with the union. And going back to what Austen was talking about that ambush election rule where if you have a non-unionized employer, they may not know all the things they can and can't do. There's a thing called tips when unions come to organize. You can't threaten, interrogate, you can't promise, and employers, can't promise or surveil. So the whole thing comes down with that employer can't say you're going to get a raise if you don't unionize. Yeah. Because that's a promise. I mean, unless it's, unless it's annual and it's the same thing every year, but for the most part, they can't make those promises. And then while they're waiting for that union contract, they're locked in. And it is one size fits all. That's why, coming out of the pandemic when inflation was skyrocketing, you had non-union workers getting bigger and quicker raises than the unionized workforce because they were stuck in those collective bargaining agreements, and it was much more bureaucratic. It was much more one size fits all. And when it comes to sectoral, they're going in the actual wrong direction there, as opposed to the individuality, such as what the Employer Rights Act has with workers' choice and letting those employers deal directly and immediately with workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not to mention, it's not from business to business, the different ways a business wants to compete and sort of innovate. Those things, diminish. And maybe somebody who works in Georgia doesn't exactly feel like the workplace should be dictated by what somebody in Connecticut does if it's, part of industries. So you lose innovation, you lose that variety for a business to say, we're going to operate this way and offer these kind of incentives to our employees versus this other one. It all gets negotiated from the top. You lose probably as, consumers, you can think about this too, not just workers. Prices change when you create, sectoral bargaining can create more of a monopoly type system. That doesn't, we don't want to see in a free enterprise economy. It kind of is trying to defeat the free enterprise notion of what we do with our businesses.
Yeah, we I4W did a study on this years ago, and looking into it, the best way for workers to get raises is switching jobs. And when you have sectoral bargaining, it takes that out of the equation because there's basically one set of wages, one standard, and it makes it harder for employers to compete. And the way they compete is by giving better working conditions, more flexibility, more money to those individual workers. And sectoral, built out to its logical extent, would be one size fits all and prevent that.
I'd imagine that a lot of corporations are in favor of it as well, because at least it would take some of that competitive spirit out of the wage market for them. They could concentrate on bringing costs down in other places. Otherwise, they'd have an even playing field with some of their biggest competitors.
Well, hopefully the good ones are looking at it and going, we want the best talent. We want to pay for the best talent. And the way to do that is to attract the best talent with better benefits, with better pay. And that's how we're going to beat our competition, because we're going to have the best. I know that's the way I think it, running I4AW, which is, once again, why we commissioned Austen to write this study.
Yeah.
How's that for bringing it full circle, David?
Yeah, there's a reform too that just came up too, that thinking about this within collective bargaining contracts. Not only is there sort of a mandated pay in terms of, this sort of minimal expectation, but there's also a ceiling. You can't give workers in a they're in collective bargaining contract, say, you just did a fantastic job, you deserve a big bonus, you deserve a pay raise. Your productivity and the difference you make for our business needs to be rewarded. But no, that doesn't happen in a collective bargaining contract. But there is a bill called a Raise Act and some other reforms here where that would be included in terms of a kind of a package legislation that we point out.
Huh.
But there's concepts like that too, where we're trying to, at least in incremental ways, open up what contracting looks like to say a business should have, you really can't pay somebody more money. And yet, I guess you could look at, there is a model out there in the private sector, players unions in sports, for instance, there actually is competitive pay. It's interesting that that doesn't come to a workplace. You can't work at an auto shop or a manufacturing plant and bring value that somebody rewards, even though you could, on a basketball court, for instance. But that's how it's set up in America right now.
So let's go in that direction. If you could talk about maybe 2 or 3 labor reforms, you can go into as much detail. I want it specific. Like, what would be the best things for the federal government to do, best reforms for them to adopt?
Yeah, well, I think Vinny mentioned, but the Employee Rights Act is an all-encompassing bill. We
Okay.
sort of call it a crown jewel because it has many. So I know I'm bringing up one bill, but
Okay.
it's actually, 10, 15 type policies. But it would be great to have something instituted in that grand of fashion. But that addresses legislation around what we say is self-employment and small businesses, the
Mm-hmm.
franchises. So it allows entrepreneurship, and most businesses start out small, and many small businesses are actually starting out as just one person. One person wants to test out whether they could actually make a successful business, so they do independent contracting work for people, and then they grow into a business that actually has employees. So they earn money as an independent contractor, but they grow as employees. So that exists within the Employee Rights Act, but there's also
So
Modern Worker
I'm
Empowerment
sorry,
Act.
what would it do with respect to those people?
Yeah, it creates, so the federal government, we didn't get much into this, and not everybody would find this super interesting to get granular, but the Department of Labor and the IRS and the National Labor Relations Board, for instance, all have different criteria to determine whether somebody is an employee or an independent contractor. It's not as simple
Hmm.
as saying you're an independent contractor, this business wants to work with you, everybody's happy. That's not the standard you have to meet. There's actually criteria, and the Employee Rights Act, and then some other bills that exist individually that we point out would would codify a test that you could actually utilize and understand in a more straightforward manner that if I go forward with this relationship, we're going to be protected. This is a freedom of contract issue. So it empowers the workers more and their clients to say that, this is a relationship we want and we're fine with it. So it orients us more in that direction. And the same thing that I mentioned the Save a Local Business Act. This is the sort of the larger version, which is towards small businesses and franchises. But the same thing, it's let's say you're a plumber and somebody installs kitchen cabinets, but they don't they don't they don't do plumbing, but they need somebody to move a pipe. Well, do you have to be an employee of that kitchen cabinet company, or can you be your own business? So you're a vendor for the other business, but there's rules and regulations that came out from President Biden, and I should mention, dating back to President Obama, we have this constant cycling of regulations that we're also trying to say you shouldn't do a 180 every time a new
Hmm.
president comes along. These would help
Hmm.
codify it, but it's been switching back and forth, and we're trying to protect this idea where you can work independently, whether you're a small business or you're an individual. So this bill does that, and then it does a lot of these democratic sort of worker-led decisions with unions, as we said. It's right to work, it's worker choice, so you can opt out of a union contract. It's the information privacy, so you get that all at once. There is a bill that I've been hopeful that would be bipartisan because federal employees enjoy this, and the federal unions brag about it, but it's called the Working Families Flexibility Act, and this is something that House Ed and Workforce is resurrecting again through hearings and markup. But this is just a simple idea that federal employees get this. When you work overtime, we're not changing anything else about overtime law, but when you work overtime, you can get time and a half pay as you currently do, or you could choose to get time and a half paid leave. So let's say you want to work extra one week. Maybe you want the extra income, but maybe you would actually love to go on vacation, or you have to take care of some matters with your family. So both businesses and individuals could now have another option, and you don't have to have all these paid leave mandates or other things that force businesses to reduce pay to afford it. Here you have something that's just built into the current criteria, and it would be very easy to do. So there's things like that I think we should have a realistic shot at in a bipartisan manner. And there's others that we're trying to grow, just understanding through this report and showing the totality of labor policy. And I don't know, Vinny, maybe you want to mention something like workers' choice that you've worked on, or there's so much we list in here. I didn't mention, actually, I'll mention one more and then turn it over, but Representative Kevin Kiley and then Senator Bill Cassidy are two examples, but they're trying to help with what we call access to benefits, portable benefits. Workers, when they're self-employed, we've created a system. It's the government that created the barrier, not the businesses, not the workers or anyone else. They've created a barrier where you can't access benefits the way employees do. We've created this employer-provided sort of health and retirement benefit system, again, dating back about 100 years ago, World War II era, that dictates so much of workplaces today. These bills would simply say workers can, kind of group together. We're doing this at the state level as well, advocating for these reforms. But we want business clients, if they want to offer benefits to independent contractors, why can they not? Well, they will be able to if these type of bills are enacted. And then there's also legislation like Association Health Plans Act. So independent contractors could pool together just like we want other Americans to, and not just have to have, we're employees at one workplace and that's the only way we can pool together and create a lower cost insurance plan. We want to open it up, which, the providers would want to do, and all the independent contractors and small businesses would love to have. And we could do it right now. There's legislation that exists. We just need it enacted, and it should be bipartisan because we've found success at the state level. We've had several states, Tennessee, Alabama, Utah, as examples, strong bipartisanship, even sponsors from both Democratic and Republican parties in these states that have driven it. And we're trying to bring that to the federal level for all Americans.
Interesting. Yeah, Vinny, any other ideas?
I think Austen rattled off a lot, and he's absolutely right. Between the Employer Rights Act, the kind of most of the good ideas in Congress right now, and he listed all those off, to the independent contractor bills, Kiley's bills, the portable benefits, workers' choice, Representative Anders' Worker Enfranchisement Act, that quorum. I don't think we mentioned the SALT Act, which requiring the disclosure of union salts, or these undercover union organizers that lie to an employer and their coworkers to get a job just to organize. All of those are fantastic. But what I would say is there are a lot there, and it's a lot to unpack. Austen does a great job with the study, and on the website, that i4aw.org/pro-worker, all of it's broken down, and it's broken down in an incredibly user-friendly way, where you have, first just the issues, then the legislation. Each can be expanded out in first a 30,000 foot view, and then either linking to the study or linking to some of the other backgrounders that we have on I4AW. It is incredibly user-friendly, and yes, there's a lot here. And I know your listeners are, their heads are probably swimming because we're talking about so many different issues and legislation, but they're all really, really well broken down on that website and in Austen's study. It is an incredibly helpful resource.
Yeah, I agree. I saw the study first. So I was reading the study, and it's chock full of information, the kind of thing you might need to save somewhere so that when something comes up, you can just, Control F and try to find some talking points on the particular bill somebody's talking about. But when you go to the website, it's really an educational experience where you can go through and sort basically two categories: tools that empower and obstacles that impede. And you've got some good things that are going on in Congress right now. It's really encouraging to see people caring about these issues. And then you've got these things that come from mainly from Democrats, but you've got some Republicans who are on board with them as well, that unfortunately make some of the problems worse. You take the coercion and either make it worse or take it into new areas of work life. And this is a great way to understand all those things in real time. So, guys, thank you for coming on. Vinny, you've talked about the I4AW website. It's the letter I, the number 4, and then AW.org. That's where you can find this study. Austen, where can we find out more about what you're doing?
Yes, well, Vinny's pointing out, so this study and the great pro worker agenda stuff is available on their site. Excuse me. But you can also find me in my regular job. I'm also at Americans for Prosperity. So americansforprosperity.org. We're covering a lot of the same material here, helping to promote this great study as well. Because I4AW is a great hub for so many of these reforms, and particularly at the federal level. Our organization at AFP is fully on board with what's happening with this as well, and really trying to help raise the voice on this issue. So, but yeah, it's a great resource, Vinny's website, for how this study is broken down. You get some of the narrative from my paper, but when it comes to just pinpointing what those bills were in an organized fashion, he did a great job with the website. So I think they're a great companion together, and we'll keep chopping at this because obviously new things will be coming and we'll be covering them for sure.
Yeah, and
Well,
AFC has been a great resource and a great partner throughout all that, in addition to Austin. So it's been fantastic working with them, not just on the study, but also on support for a lot of this legislation in Congress. And they're great work supporting things like the Employee Rights Act and some of the other legislation.
these bills tend to come up year after year, session after session. So hopefully this is an evergreen product that will kind of tell us what the lay of the land will be over the next decade or two. So thank you guys for coming on, and appreciate your work on this.